Oh, right. How do I make this thing public? Right. There's a few people listening in. This is Joel Pearson. It's my first time using Callin at all, actually, and I ended up hosting something. And today I'm interested in talking about whether Jesus existed. So the historicity of Jesus is not a question about whether the magic, divine, demigod Jesus existed, about whether Christianity is true. It's a question of whether a historical Jesus, a regular guy, existed, or whether this was an invention. So we've got examples throughout history. A great example of this is Islam. So, who was the founder of Islam? If you consider that Islam was founded by Muhammad, that's what the historians think. But what Islam claims is that Islam was founded by the angel Gabriel. So the angel Gabriel spoke to Muhammad, appeared to him on a mountain, and then Muhammad wrote down what the angel Gabriel said. So the angel Gabriel is ultimately claimed to be the founder of Islam. So we have this comparison. Where do we go with Christianity? Is Jesus the equivalent of the angel Gabriel appearing to the founders of Christianity? And would that make, say, Peter, for example, the founder of Christianity? Or is Jesus the equivalent of the angel, or the equivalent of the historical Muhammad? In which case, does that mean that Muhammad and Jesus are equivalent? In which case, who appears to Jesus? Who tells Jesus to start this cult? And there's a lot of evidence and arguments for this in either direction, but it would be interesting to discuss the details with someone if anyone's interested in joining in. But in the meantime, I might as well list things. So Christians have set up the idea that the New Testament's construction is actually not in the order in which it was written. So when you read the New Testament, you start with Matthew, but Matthew was one of the later things written towards the end of the first century, possibly second century. Um, so that narrative makes you believe that this historical Jesus, this man walking around on earth, is the beginning of the New Testament. But if you take the order in which they were actually written, it begins with things like the epistles of Paul, and that tells a very different story. People who read Paul expecting to find out about Jesus will be quite disappointed because they'll only find the Jesus that appeared to visions, appeared to Paul in visions, spoke to him in his dreams, or effectively spoke to him while he was reading the Old Testament scriptures. So the way that historicity tends to be argued for is to argue that the gospel story comes first, and that's the starting Jesus, and then he turns into this visionary Jesus later. The way that the sources are actually dated in the mainstream scholarship, like non-Christian, or even most Christians actually, it's like non-fundamentalist Christian scholars would date it, is that the Gospels come after the epistles. So the timing of this is quite interesting because the earliest epistles we have were written sort of 49 AD onwards to around the 50s AD, thereabouts. The earliest gospel we have is Mark. That is post-war. So after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, after effectively the first generation of Christians dies out, that's when Mark appears. And it was not written in Jerusalem. It was not written in the native language like Hebrew or Aramaic. It was written in Greek. It appears to have been written outside of Judea. So this is a Greco-Roman writing. So it's in the wrong language, in the wrong time, in the wrong place. And yet we trust this book to give us an accurate representation of a historical Jesus. So one of the first things you like to do in history is look at your sources. What are your primary sources? Where are your eyewitness accounts? Where's your discussion of evidence? What, how critical is the person writing? So, like, if it's a historian, then they'll say, "Okay, I've got these sources. This is how credible they are. This is where I think they go back to the original data," and they'll treat them carefully. What we get from Mark is he doesn't cite any sources. He doesn't claim to be an eyewitness. He doesn't tell you who he is. It's actually anonymous. We just put the name Mark on it later. So we've got an anonymous author writing fiction stories effectively. Because again, we're arguing this from a perspective as historians. So we're not looking at the existence of gods or magic or anything like that. This is a question of, was there a real guy behind these stories? And Mark is fiction. So there's no doubt about that. So we're trying to work out, is there anything under Mark that is actually true? So we have this problem where we've got an anonymous author who doesn't cite eyewitnesses. Well, okay, then, where is he getting this from? Well, Mark seems to be using the epistles of Paul. There are elements of Paul where Mark is actually taking pieces of Paul's stories. So, a great example of this is the Lord's Supper. This is what it's called in Paul. It's often misquoted as the Last Supper, but that's something that was created within the gospel narrative. And if you look at Paul's source for this, so this Lord's Supper with Paul is supposed to be the night he's handed over, and he has a meal. But what he's doing is basically like an instructional piece to camera. He's doing this is how you do this ritual. So obviously this isn't plausible. We know people don't really have the ability to predict the future. And what is Paul's source for this as well? Well, he says he got it in a vision. So can we trust a vision as a real source for this event? So that one's out the window. And now that we know that Mark is using Paul as his source, why isn't Mark using a source that actually met Jesus? Oh, we got someone coming in. Hi, Keith. You're on mute at the moment, Keith. Are you able to join in and speak?
Hello?
Hello. Right, you've joined the show.
Yes, I would like to remind you and the listeners that Jesus was actually prophesied to appear. Therefore, it was not of his doing. There was already a specific time when he was to appear, and there was a specific death that was already prophesied for him. So regardless
Yes,
of
yeah, based
any
on
of the information you might bring to doubt, the fact that it was already prophesied is clear.
yeah. So what you've got there is a great example. This is based on the Danielic timetable. So Daniel was written around 164, 163 BC, and the intention was to predict Jewish victory, end of the world, apocalypticism. That prophecy failed. It didn't happen. But if you redo the maths, what happens is you can move this event by, like, interpreting days as weeks or years and that kind of thing. You can move this towards like the 30s or middle of the first century AD. So this is actually evidence against Jesus existing. So prophecy isn't real, but what you can do is you can try and make a prophecy happen. And it wasn't just Jesus. It's worth knowing background information on this. There were tons of messiahs popping up all over the place at this point because a lot of different cults of Judaism had the same idea. They were reading the same scriptures. They had the same timetable in mind. They wanted to fight against the Romans, which is why the war started and why Rome eventually crushed Jerusalem. So this is a great way to create a Messiah. If you want your Messiah to be born at this particular time, you just put one there. It doesn't mean that they're a real person. So it's not great evidence for Jesus existing, but it shows why somebody would invent a Messiah. So yeah, thanks. That was a great example of evidence against Jesus.
Yeah, I just find it funny. Oh, sorry.
Oh, you got a big echo going on.
Sorry, dude. My bad.
No worries.
I find it funny. I think a majority of people, even practicing Christians, think that the books of Mark and Paul and John are actually written by those people at the time or shortly after the time. And it kind of feeds into their belief that like the Bible was directly inspired by God. And it's just not true. Like it's like you were saying, it was written much later than those people uh, were active or alive.
Yeah, this is why we need to clarify a lot of background information, because if you assume that everybody involved in the conversation already knows all this stuff, like the order of the epistles first and then the gospels, the fact that the gospels are anonymous, the amount of forgery that goes on within Christianity as well. So, for example, Bart Ehrman wrote a book called Forged. He also wrote Forgery and Counterforgery, if you want the like the academic version. But basically, he pointed out 3/4 of the New Testament are forgeries, anonymous, or misattributed. We only know one author of the New Testament, and that was Paul. We've got like the first names of some other people, but we don't know who they were. They were just, it's a name on a book. We know half of Paul's epistles were forgeries, written by people pretending to be Paul. The Gospels are anonymous. They don't say who wrote them, which is typical of religious literature. Um, the idea that the message comes straight from God, so you don't put the author's name on it. And later on as well, you've got the names attributed. So around the 180s, I think it was Irenaeus, was it? I'm trying to remember who it was, who added these names onto the Gospels. But even then, they didn't say these are the authors. They used the word kata, which is like according to. It's this. This is how you cite a source, not the author writing it. So it's like this is the tradition of Mark and the tradition of Matthew. So Christians tend to think that these were real people. They sometimes took a name from a character mentioned within the story and claimed that that was them. Um, but we have no evidence that these people actually wrote this. We don't know who they were because they literally don't tell us who they were. In fact, the title of Mark, the original title, is Mark 1:1. The right at the beginning, if you read that verse, that is effectively designed to be the title of the book. No other callers at the moment, so what we can do is we can look at some other contextual parts of history. So a great example of how this all works is mystery cults. So after Alexander the Great's conquest, he introduced this concept of integrating other religions within his own empire. So to the point where he would basically merge elements of their gods with elements of his pantheon, and you end up with these Hellenistic synchronized or syncretized mystery cults, where you have like a divine savior of some sort, usually descended from one of the seasonal gods who heralded the spring and died during the winter, something like that. But they became a personal savior, and this personal savior would guarantee you an afterlife if you worship them. But one thing about these cults was that they would have concepts that they would keep secret and only teach to insiders. It's very much like conspiracy theories. People like to think that they've got the secret truth and no one else has this truth. So this is quite appealing at the time, and this looks a lot like Christianity, to the point where Paul actually uses the word mysterion repeatedly and talks about mysteries. He talks about other followers that he's writing to only being babes within the cults, and he will only give them milk until they're old enough and understand enough to give them the meat. So you can see how this is all like piecing together, where Christianity didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed within the context of its time. It was influenced by the various religious influences around it at the time. And this was a time when Judaism was really branching out, very cosmopolitan. There were a lot of um, people from outside Judea living within Jerusalem or passing through and trading as caravans and so on. So you get a lot of different influences. We can also see this in Judaism before Christianity even started, where Judaism was heavily influenced by Babylonian invasion. The Babylonians and later on the Persians have a major religion of Zoroastrianism, which is still around today. It's the religion that Freddie Mercury grew up in, so it's still a well-known large religion. And this is something where they had the concept of a devil, which was antagonistic to a god. And we see Christianity pick this up and run with it. They've got their Satan. Satan was a minor character in the Old Testament. He was basically like an advisor, like someone who would play devil's advocate and argue against the king without fear of execution, which was a real role within the old courts, because um, kings were such despots that they could execute anyone at any time. So it was very dangerous to speak out against the king. So what happened was this role was developed where someone basically had diplomatic immunity against the king and could challenge their ideas and make sure they were making good decisions. This is pretty much where the role of Satan arose, and then it took on the Zoroastrian influence and became a counter to the god. Hey Keith, you're in again. You're still on mute, Keith. Okay, I guess Keith is just going to wait. So we can talk about some of the other influences within the time. So one thing that mystery cults had in common was they tended to have ritual meals. So this is like the Eucharist, where you symbolically eat the flesh and drink the blood of your God. Another thing they did was baptisms. We see other mystery cults at the time, the Eleusinian mysteries. There's the story of the Golden Ass. There's the Osiris cult as well, the Romulus cults, and the idea was that you were washing yourself away of the past and bringing yourself into this new life under the deity. One other interesting concept that may not occur to most people is the idea of the firmament. So, if you say heaven to somebody now, they'll think of the modern Christian concept, which is like multi-dimensional, extra-dimensional. It doesn't exist within our reality. But if you go back in time and get into the context of first century Judaism, they believed heaven was a real physical place. Like, you look at the moon, you look at the planets and the stars. They believed that the firmament was a dome above a flat earth, and they believed that you could physically elevate yourself into the clouds and the sky and visit these other worlds. That was what they meant by heaven or cosmos. So when it mentions things like burying Jesus, this is very realistically a place within the cosmos. You could have burials within the sky. It's a concept of Platonic forms as well, the idea that there are more and more perfect layers as you ascend into the heavens, where um, I think this is still used in Christian lingo of these times. Basically, people say, as above, so below. Is this concept that there are copies of everything, and Earth is like the lowest, least perfect copy. Are you stuck on mute, Keith? Okay, I'll keep waiting for Keith, I guess. Right, so that was yeah, the cosmos, the firmament, the concepts of that. We actually have an example of burial even within Judaism, within the heavens, which is the life of Adam and Eve. I think it's also known as the revelation of Moses, where Adam is buried within the third heaven after his death. So that works. So when people try and argue that Jesus existed because Paul said he was buried, this is consistent with a celestial deity. Other things Paul says. So basically, all Paul tells you about Jesus is that he died and he was raised. That's pretty much it. He says that Jesus is the brother of everybody. So all Christians who are baptized become brothers of Jesus or sisters of Jesus. He says that Jesus was basically born of the sperm of David, is the phrase he uses. Or more accurately, sort of created from the sperm of David. Now, we don't know whether that means he thinks he was literally made of David's sperm, or whether that's because that sentence can also mean descended from David. But we know where he got the idea. He said this was because of scripture. There was a belief that a Messiah would be of Davidic origin. So you can jump the queue and go straight to David's son, or you can sort of turn it into a descent thing. There are various ways to try and rescue Jesus. Effectively, you kind of have to disregard what Paul says. So Paul explicitly says that his only source for Jesus is visions and scripture. So you could argue that Paul's lying. The problem with that is you then remove Paul as a reliable witness, and Paul is the earliest witness. So because Mark is based on Paul, that means the entire edifice of Christian texts is founded on lies. So I don't think that's a great way to go, but you have to do something about Paul because Paul is mythicist and Paul is the oldest Christian text we have. You have to do something with it. So one way that people argue for Jesus to get around this problem, this is something that Bart Ehrman does. He basically takes the Gospels, rips them into pieces, claims that each individual piece is independent attestation of Jesus that isn't affected by the other pieces, teleports these pieces back in time and places them before Paul. Effectively, he invents imaginary sources and then claims that these are all independent eyewitness accounts. So, I mean, you can make an infinite number of imaginary sources by doing that, and you can say they say whatever you want them to say. So, I don't think it's a great method, but unfortunately, this is the best we've got from people arguing for the existence of Jesus. There are only two recent arguments for the existence of Jesus, which is Bart Ehrman and Maurice Casey. Both of them wrote before Richard Carrier wrote his peer-reviewed volume on the historicity of Jesus, which was in 2014. And there really hasn't been much of a response defending Jesus after that. There is another PhD scholar, Raphael Latasta, who wrote Questioning the Historicity of Jesus in 2019. So we've got two scholars with relevant PhDs arguing that Jesus didn't exist. Not really anyone arguing the other direction. There is one academic work arguing that Jesus did exist. This was Shirley Jackson Case, who is a theologian, and this was back in 1911, I think it was. So he's a Christian, so he's a bit biased. He's a theologian, but at least he did a peer-reviewed academic work defending Jesus. Vlad, you've joined. You're on mute. Would you like to say anything?
Yeah, what you're saying basically is um, it has been challenged. There was a book written by the former atheist converted to Christianity, who's Christian for several years. Who wrote the book The Case for Christ, and he wrote the Case for the Real Christ. Lee Strobel.
Lee Strobel, that's right, yeah.
Lee Strobel is very well educated. I think he's a journalist and he's a lawyer, and he did investigative journal, investigative research to try to disprove Christianity, only to at the end of the day end up becoming a Christian.
Yeah,
That's
I
one
read
source.
that book.
That's one source.
Well,
The
so he's not an academic source. He's not arguing for the existence of a historical Jesus. He's actually
No,
arguing
he
for
did. He did.
the
When he
divine
made
Jesus.
the case for the Christ was one, and then he had to write another book called The Case for the Real Christ. So he has several subsequent books to disprove, because your arguments that you're bringing up in comparisons to other Christ in other religions, he answers your story. Just got to get these books. And
No,
again,
I have read the books.
okay,
In
okay.
particular, the case for Christ was answered very well by Professor Robert Price, so a PhD in theology.
Hmm.
He sort of showed the way that Lee Strobel went around his approach. So he didn't ask critical questions. He didn't push back on anything. He almost entirely asked Christian apologists rather than historians, for example. And like I said, he's arguing he believes in the biblical, divine Jesus. So it's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about, like, was there a regular guy, or was there like no regular guy? It's kind of where we're looking. But I mean, so if he's got good arguments, would you like to restate the best of his positions? Like, let's steel man this and talk about
Because
what's his best evidence for Jesus.
Joe, everything weighs in solely on the resurrection, on the death and resurrection. Tacitus wrote about Jesus. Josephus wrote about Jesus. There's many historians. The Jews wrote about Jesus, but in their books to criticize, because they hated Jesus. And I'm talking about the leaders, the men of the law, Sanhedrins, Sadducees, Pharisees. All together,
Well,
they
so
were
so a lot of
united
those we
against.
don't have accounts from. A lot of that
Okay.
is we don't actually have them as sources. So let's take this piece by piece. So firstly, resurrection didn't happen either on a historical Jesus or a mythical Jesus. It's a fiction either way, so it's not really relevant to this. We can put that to one side. You said Tacitus as an example. So
Yeah,
what was
there's
Tacitus's
there's
source?
writing. Basically, he was a historian. He was there in that time. He was
Yeah.
able to
So
write about
where
that.
did he say he got his information about Jesus?
Real life events. He was exposed to everything you're talking about.
Did
The
he
same thing with
actually?
Josephus.
You're saying he was an eyewitness of
They
Jesus?
yeah, they were present when those events
Okay,
were
so
were
you
being
say
created.
Tacitus was an eyewitness of Jesus. What year was Tacitus
I'm
born?
not gonna say he was an eyewitness in the sense he was there present, but he wrote of the events surrounding Jesus. He wouldn't be writing
Yeah,
if
so
Jesus
so
didn't
what was his
exist.
source? How did he know that?
That I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly, to be honest.
I agree. He didn't tell us. We don't know. So the most likely source of that. Okay, so Tacitus may have been a Christian forgery, but we can leave that to one side and just go with assuming that he wrote that. Let's say,
And then and
how
then
did
and
he
then you
know
men-
that?
and then you mentioned Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman just contradicted himself in a video with other atheists in his class where he said Jesus did exist. So what is it? Does
Yeah,
Jesus exist or not? Because
no,
Bart
no. So
Ehrman, he's a credible scholar, well known, and debater, and he just said, "I never said Jesus never existed." So
no,
what
I,
is it?
I
Did he
agree.
not
Bart
exist,
Ehrman
or
never
did he
said.
exist?
No, I didn't cite Bart Ehrman as saying Jesus didn't exist. Bart Ehrman did a great examination of the sources in the New Testament, who wrote them, when were they written, all that stuff. He does believe Jesus existed, and I pointed out some of his arguments and why they don't really work. But just go back to Tacitus. So Tacitus's most likely source, assuming that he mentioned Christians, would have been Pliny. He was Pliny's best friend, effectively. The two of them
Okay.
wrote to each other regularly, and we actually have Pliny's account. Pliny does cite a source for how he knows this. He interrogated Christians, and he was doing this well into the second century, which means by that point the Christians he's talking to were just citing the Gospels. But the Gospels exist on either theory, because the point is the Gospels are making a historical Jesus and putting him into history. So the existence of the Gospels doesn't really help argue for a historical Jesus. They exist in either case. So what we really need is something before the Gospels to show that Jesus existed at that point. So second century Christians, plus also they didn't actually say he was a historical man. If you read what it says in Pliny, he said they were worshiping this guy as a god, as Christ. So it's not a great example of evidence for a historical Jesus if they're talking about God Jesus. We're looking for evidence of that there was a man who existed. Did you cite Josephus as well as another source?
That was another source.
Yeah,
And
so
I
the
mean,
antiquities.
if the gospel stories don't tell you about Jesus written by the apostles, then what other evidence do you want? Because you can never have the same story said the same way, otherwise it
You
won't
just
be
say the
believable.
Gospels were written by apostles.
Well, the knowledge was given to the apostles, and the scribes were the ones that wrote it. But it wasn't given to the scribes; it was given to the apostles. That's why they're named after them.
It's not why
And
they're
each
named after them, no.
and each account and each sorry and each sorry and each account has to be different, even though they're similar, but never the same. And I kind of compare it, and I use this bad analogy in a way. In, for example, like when you have an accident in a car, right? You have five witnesses in that car. They all luckily survive. They come out of the car, and when the cops are interviewing them, they all experience the crash, and they all give their account as testimony. Do they all give the same account? No. But as the cops are interviewing them and taking their side of the story, they're able to put together what happened. The accident happened. It's evident. Cars crashed. Two cars banged up, or whatever. How many cars were involved? And all eyewitness account were there present. They all saw it in their own way, but they experienced the exact same event. But they all wrote about it, so that they're able to understand a different story. Now, if all the
Well,
people involved in that crash,
let's stop there for a second, and
what else?
just readdress that. So, I think the car crash is a great analogy. What you'll get is the same event told in different ways. Yeah, everyone will tell it
Exactly.
in their own words. That's not what you get in the Gospels. The Gospels actually quote each other verbatim at times. So this is called the synoptic problem: the fact that Matthew and Luke knew Mark and used Mark. So that means they're not eyewitnesses, because if they were eyewitnesses, they would have, for one thing, they would have said they were eyewitnesses. They would have said who they were, because that's how you would validate that you were an eyewitness. And they would have told the story in their own words, not just copied from someone else. So what you're using as an analogy there is destroying your own argument effectively.
Yeah,
But
but even
something else you used.
in a crash, you would still get very similar things. I'm not going to say they're necessarily going to be quoting unless they sat down and said, "Hey, dude, I want to make sure I quote you because we're going to be interviewed." I don't think that was the case.
Yeah,
But they will
any
be
teacher
honest
who's
enough.
marked papers can spot plagiarism, can spot some things like what's going on in the Gospels. They are literally copying word for word from Mark, which
And
is
I believe
that's not
by
independent.
now, I think by now enough translations have corrected, because that is what is believed to, the, for example, the King James version of the Bible, which independent fundamentals claim to be the most correct. No, there is actual parts where it's been proven by scholars like Dr. James R. White from Alpha and Omega Ministries, and basically what he said, and we wrote a book on it, and he challenged the ISBs on this because they were claiming that the KJV Bible was the closest. Well, the problem with that is that he's proven as a scholar in doing textual criticism that there's errors. Does it mean that errors that were misplaced? No. He explains why is it that they copied one from the other, but the subsequent versions of the Bible, the NIV, the NASV, the ESV, they all correct that. That's why they're critical, and they come up with conspiratorial theories saying that the devil is doing that, they're taking away from it, they're robbing from. No, what they're doing is correcting. So a lot of those things have already been corrected to give you a
Well,
pure
so we're
gospel.
not talking about the English translations here. When we're talking about the scholarship and examining historicity, we're looking at the original Greek, and this is the PhD
Exactly.
experts who read that
Mhm.
if almost like a native, basically.
Well, And,
So
and basically, men like James White would have been calling out if there would have been any errors, if there would have been something questionable, if there would have been no Christ or a fictitious story. The story of Christ in the Bible, there is no mythological language in the Greek. For something like that, they would have probably used other language. That's the
what do you mean
point.
there's no mythological language?
Okay, the Greek and the Hebrew written for his time for those stories are not myths. Many people like to say, "Oh, it's the myth," but they speak out of ignorance. They're not speaking because they're citing a source or because they know the Greek or the Hebrew. The Hebrews, when they wrote, they weren't citing myths. It wasn't mythology they were using. Otherwise, they would have said they would have been. They wrote, for example, when the Bible's translated, it is translated correctly in the sense in its genre, in its figure of speech, in its metaphors, the similes, hyperboles.
Yeah, so I would
If there's
agree
something
the
like, for
Bible
example, let me
is.
give you an example. Let me give you an example. If I tell you Jesus Christ is the door, do I expect to see a door with old rusty hinges every time I open? No. It's just meaning he's a way
Yeah,
to God.
so if you
So
are you familiar with Mark chapter 4?
go
There's
ahead.
a section where Mark says all of these things are being told in parables, basically to mislead the readers, the uninitiated. And I agree. I think that the vast majority of what's in the New Testament is metaphor, is parable stories, is it's myths, effectively.
Well, no, because the parables basically convey a truth. And like, for example, if you look at the very events, if you look at for example, the parable of the seed, the sower, the agricultural field, the field used as the heart of men, those are existent, those are truthful, they're not off the wall. Now if the parables were to say, well, this intergalactic world, obviously it would be like, wait a minute, we don't understand that, what are you talking? So it had to be spoken to people that were the least educated, the people that work in the field. In those times, not everybody was highly educated, knew how to read. So he had to talk to them in a language where they would understand. But at the same time, it baffled the scholars, because why the mysteries were made known to who? To believers. The
Well,
mystery starting with the gospel.
that's a really
That
good
that, that is what
example
the
that
Bible says. The
people.
mysteries were made known to babes, basically. It didn't say to highly intellectuals. That's why it baffles scholars that they're not able to understand simple things that God made to be believable. He didn't make some rocket science uh, um, theory or formula, so you could have to work it out to figure it out. No, he made it so simple,
Well,
and
so
he had to
you're
do it
talking
for the
about
people of their
people's
time.
respecting. Just a sec. You mentioned looking up to people who can read. Like reading the scriptures. This was a huge thing in Judaism. The
Well,
idea that anyone could actually read the original scriptures, or in this particular case, they're quoting from the Septuagint, because the
mhm,
New Testament authors couldn't read Hebrew; they were reading Greek, the
correct.
translations. That's in fact where the mistranslation in Matthew comes from, where he talks about the virgin birth. This is
Mhm,
because the Septuagint has a mistranslation of the Hebrew. There's a section in Isaiah where it mentions a young woman. In the Septuagint translation, it's translated to virgin, which is the wrong translation. And then Matthew takes that and uses it to create a virgin birth story. So you can see where the mistranslation has happened and how he's got hold of the wrong end of the stick, effectively. Um,
No,
what's
because
happening if you look at the way the apostles
Ma-
spoke?
yeah, Mary was a virgin. That's not off the wall.
Well, so there was a Virgin Mary.
The
That's
highest virtue when you marry someone, even at that time when you betroth, is you marry a virgin. That's not off the wall. That was very
well.
common and expected.
So
So to
this is
marry
one
some
piece of
kind of
evidence
whore or some
against
woman that,
Jesus.
I don't know about that. I would question that big time.
No, so okay, so virgin birth isn't a real thing. This is myth. So this is evidence that.
No, no, you cannot
So
say
to be
that.
fair,
That's your
you can
opinion.
create these. So
That's
it's
your opinion. You're not being honest to the language. To say that it's myth. It's not mythology in what it was written. If you give me
so
the avatars of the Hindu religion, that is myth. But if you
I
tell
think
me
your
that that
methodology is wrong though. You're using faith to argue for this instead of using reason. And also
okay, so
we
now
know
I'm
for a
lacking reason
fact that
because I
this
tell you
doesn't
that
happen.
these things happen.
No,
Wow.
so we know virgin births don't happen. You can count the
Well, no,
number of
no.
virgin
Okay,
births on
I
your 0
understand.
hands.
But in this unique case, if it happened and there's evidence for it, and there's been written about it, and there's eyewitness testimony to it, to account of the story of Jesus Christ, then it has to be given the proper credit and recognized.
If there was evidence, great, but that's my point. There
Again,
is no evidence.
no,
So
you
people can
cannot
write
say that
stories
because
about
those
Harry
people
Potter
look
way before. Doesn't mean it's true.
back then. Okay, I understand about the Harry Potter and all that, but I also understand that there wasn't the information we have now. There wasn't these universities to question plagiarism or different governments to question or bring your scientists. There was no science. All you had was eyewitness account, and there
So,
was many for that. So it has to. Just can't
well, no. So there are
dispense it.
zero eyewitness accounts. This is one of the points, that there are zero eyewitness accounts of Jesus.
If that was so, then how do you explain the brothers of Jesus being born long after him, after the
The
virgin birth?
brothers, the brothers of
The
Jesus.
father, Joseph, the father, the comforter, being well known in his community, he was born.
Okay, do you
Virgin
have
was
do you have an account
Mary.
from Joseph? Do you have an account from Mary?
Well, you have to go back to the Bible. You have to go back to the biblical scripture.
Yeah, there's no book of Joseph. There's no book of Mary.
No, there
There
not
are
have
no
to be a
accounts
book
from
of
them.
the book wasn't about him, but it spoke of Joseph, the father
So
of Jesus.
you can't cite sources you don't have. You can't say we can use Joseph as an eyewitness of Jesus when we literally don't have what Joseph said
Well,
or wrote.
again, that's why you have to go, and you cannot discount it. You're trying to discount the Bible is not credible. It is credible.
No,
It's
I mean
been
it's literally not in the Bible. You
no,
can't cite a
Joseph. The
source you
story. Wait a
don't
minute. The
have.
story of the no. The story about the father of Jesus is in the story. It's not about Joseph. There's not a separate book about Joseph, just like there's not a separate book of Mary. But they are mentioned as characters that were part of that plot with Jesus.
I agree. They're mentioned as characters, and it's not an
Okay,
eyewitness account.
so
So
it
you
cannot be
don't
thrown
have
away.
Joseph as the source.
For example, you cannot discount that Herod, Herod,
Well, so let's
or
just do this basic
was
logical
involved.
point, okay? You said that you had Joseph as a source. Do you now concede you do not have Joseph as a source?
Yeah, all I have is a biblical source to go by. That's all I'm saying in that
Yeah,
sense. But
that's
at the
not
same
one
time,
source. It's a bunch of individual different
no.
sources that you
What
have to
about the
look at.
story? What about the story that they were involved in the crucifixion of Christ? Pontius Pilate and Herod. Will you believe those? Those were also spoken of in history.
Great. Okay.
Those
Do you have a source from Pontius Pilate, or do you have a source from Herod that mentions Jesus?
history people again, people like Tacitus and especially Josephus, they wrote about him.
Yeah,
He's in our
we
history
addressed
books. He's
Tacitus.
well known. These are well known characters of that time.
Yeah,
They're
we
well
addressed
known.
Tacitus's source. I don't think we addressed Josephus yet, but because
Okay.
you kind of went on a tangent. But so we know Tacitus's most likely source, assuming he wrote that, is Pliny, and we know Pliny was just interrogating Christians who were just repeating the Gospels. So that's not independent. I'm sure you would agree that a source has to be independent to be of value, because there's no point saying one guy said something and 50 other people repeat it. You don't have 50 sources; you just got the one, because it has to be an independent source.
Yeah, but the gospel was copied many times for people that were persecuted, and people don't die for a lie, Joe. People don't die for a
Well,
lie.
people die
They
for a
di-
lie
they
all the
die. They'll
time.
die for the truth of their
So
convictions, but
I
they
assume
never die for. So you have over 16,000 copies of the original manuscript because we don't have the originals.
I can make a
But
million
and so you have
copies on the Origin of
16,000. So that means
Species.
there was about approximately 16,000 people, give or take. I know I'm throwing a number off, that had to survive all sorts of persecution because people wanted to destroy Christianity. People do not.
So
If this is not
let
evidence
me
for you,
just use
people
another
do not.
example.
Go ahead.
Do you believe that Islam is true?
Well, yeah, it's here.
No, I mean, do you believe that Muhammad was the prophet and that Allah is the God and that
Okay,
all the
in its
Quran is true?
tenets and how it formed, no.
Right. So
But did it
people
happen?
die for that.
Did
People have
yeah,
literally
they
killed
do,
themselves for
but
that religion.
they call themselves martyrs, but they blow themselves out. That's not martyrdom. Martyrdom demands that somebody is persecuting you,
You
somebody's
just
about
said,
to kill you.
yeah,
No,
they
but
perceive
wait a
that
minute.
they are being persecuted. Yeah.
I understand, but Joe, when somebody blows themselves up, where is the persecutor other than the person blowing themselves up? Are they self-persecuting? Is that
Are you
really?
saying that?
That's more like a suicide, not a martyrdom. That's a suicide.
Yeah. Are you
So you,
saying that they don't think they have a good reason for doing that? Because you were just
they,
claiming that
it doesn't matter whether they have a good reason or not. The
you
question
just
at
claimed
hand you
that if
ask,
you're willing to die,
is it martyrdom? No. Is it self-suicide, self-sacrifice? Yes.
yeah, so you just claimed if someone's willing to die for an idea, that idea must be true. Are you now retracting that claim?
No, I'm not. I'm referring to Islam. But when I'm referring in comparison to Christianity, because that is what we're talking about, is people do not die for a lie. People are not martyred. People are not crucified upside down. People are not burned with oil or set on
So
fire.
you're now
You know,
converting to
if
Islam
it was
because
a
you're
lie.
claiming
No,
you're
not at
claiming that
all.
people don't
Not,
die for a
not at
lie,
all,
so
because
you must now convert to Islam.
Islam is the least religion that has been persecuted.
Well,
The
then your
ones that
own
have done
argument
the
doesn't
most
work.
persecution, no, The ones that have done the most persecution, even against Christians, have been Islamists.
But you're now special pleading. You're saying, okay, my method works for Christianity, but it doesn't work for any
No,
other
I'm
religion.
going back to the basics. You said what is martyrdom? Is that what they do in martyrdom? I told you it's not. It's self-suicide because no one is martyring them. When they blow themselves up in front of people to prove a point, to terrorize, and nobody's persecuting you, that is you're committing suicide on your own terms while you blow up yourself in the center to kill other people, to put a point, whatever you want to do, whatever you want to believe, whether it's true or not. You blow yourself. That is not comparable to someone being persecuted and eventually being hung, put on fire, crucified upside down, or crucified like Christ, to the point where they're being killed. That is not the same martyrdom.
Yeah,
If
that's
I
not
blow
logically
myself
valid.
up today, let me give you, if I blow myself up today at the college right here, because I have a difference of opinion, political, religious, nobody's persecuting me. I'm doing that out of my own
Let
volition.
me just interject there. Okay, let me say, do you believe that it's possible for someone to be honestly wrong about something?
Of course, there's many people in history that have been honestly wrong.
Okay, so your entire argument collapses then because you're just
No,
talking
no,
about
because
certainty.
you're saying that everything that they're saying has to be true. Do people commit self-sacrifice on a misguided value called Islam? Yes, I do believe. It's
Yeah,
unfortunate
so
that
they
they
can do
do that.
exactly the same for Christianity because
No, they
otherwise you're
don't, because
begging the question.
Christianity is they're being persecuted. Somebody's doing it to them. They're
So
not
people
going
can
up
be
there and blowing
persecuted for any
themselves up.
reason.
That's very different. That's very different. Again, people that live by conviction, they will be persecuted for their faith. People that also live wrongfully by their conviction, they'll blow themselves up too. That's Islam. Nobody's
Yeah, so
persecuting.
that's not valid then, because people can die for beliefs that they believe are true, even if those beliefs are actually false. So that doesn't prove that it's true at all. And persecution again happens to all kinds of people all over the world throughout history. It doesn't prove that they're right. I'm going to take the next caller now because I think
Oh,
we've. Oh
okay,
no,
go ahead.
someone joined and then disappeared immediately.
It's all good. Good talking to you, man.
Okay, thanks. Okay, somebody else joined and then left, so I guess I can address some of the other stuff that I haven't actually brought up yet. Um, so we have a really interesting example within Paul of the first instance Paul mentioning of anyone talking about Jesus. This is in 1 Corinthians 15. It's one of the earliest creeds we have of Christianity. And what Paul says there is that Jesus appeared in visions. This is after Jesus is dead. There's no hint of Jesus appearing to people before he dies. And this is, he says it's according to the scriptures. He keeps saying that and using that word. So what it looks like is Paul and the other apostles are reading the Septuagint and associated literature in Greek, and then they're having visions or claiming to have visions. We don't know if they were telling the truth of this Jesus, and then everything kind of snowballs from that point onwards, because it's not until lifetimes later that you start to get the Gospels appearing. So where is this Jesus founder cult guy if he doesn't appear until the Gospels, until everyone dies from the original part of the cult? But why does Paul know nothing about Jesus? He knows nothing about his family. He knows nothing about anywhere he's ever been or anywhere he's ever met until after he dies and he appears to people in visions. We get the same thing from Hebrews. Hebrews is unaware of Jesus being on earth. We get the same thing in 1 Peter. 1 Peter is unaware of Jesus being on earth. Same thing in 1 Clement. 1 Clement is unaware of Jesus being on earth. And all of them, when they say they quote Jesus, what they're actually quoting is the Old Testament scriptures. So unless Jesus exclusively spoke in Old Testament scriptures and hide until he was born, he hid and then died, and then after that appeared to people, it's really difficult to make a historical Jesus out of this. Um, but like, I mean, you can see the examples used there. So martyrdom, the idea that people wouldn't die for a lie. This is an argument that's not used by historians. This is an argument that's used by believers. And it's easy to see how the logic breaks down. Like anyone could die for something they believe, even if the thing they believe is not true. All the examples of martyrdom, a lot of them are just Christian fictions. There may have been some martyrs dying for Christianity, but this is 2nd century onwards, so they don't know whether Jesus existed or not. This is after the first generation. People will claim that Paul died as a martyr. We don't know how Paul died. We don't know how Peter died either. We really have very little information. In fact, one of the biggest problems with this is we have 0 documents from the entire 1st century of Christianity's existence. What we've got is later copies of copies of copies of copies, and we've only got bits and pieces of those, so we've got a huge black hole in our evidence. And what we have to do is try and piece together what did it originally look like based on the surviving pieces that Christians have kept around for thousands of years now. They destroyed the vast majority of the original writings, so that we've got 6 or 7 letters of Paul. Paul must have written hundreds of letters. Where are the rest? Why don't we know what he said? Same with the other apostles. We know the other apostles wrote letters because Paul was doing that, and he didn't accuse any of them of being illiterate. So the apostles seem to have been people who could read, specifically in Greek, and then they would write letters and spread the church this way. But we don't know what they were writing. Why don't we know? So yeah, there's a huge problem. We can't be certain. So I would actually argue that as well. So people who are arguing that we're certain in either direction can't really trust that. We don't know in either way. We can guess one way, we can guess the other way. We're kind of stuck in a position of agnosticism, which is always the case when we're dealing with history. Because your epistemology has to account for being wrong. If you don't leave room for evidence proving you wrong, you will always be wrong, because you need to always have the opportunity to change your mind. And this is a fundamental epistemological thing. So imagine you believe absolutely in anything, and the rest of the universe, like all the evidence in the world, proves you wrong, but you will never change your mind because you've left no room to have your mind changed. So we are a bit stuck in history. It's unlikely any new evidence will surface. You never know, we might find something. But we're pretty much stuck with what we've got. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's unlikely that I will change my mind on this, just because we've already examined what we have. We've gone over this evidence with a fine-tooth comb. We've seen hundreds of years of arguments from Christians and from non-Christians, and we've arrived at today. So what we need is someone to write a good defense of historicity. It can't be that hard to defend Jesus. Why has nobody done it? We've had this book from Bart Ehrman, which is outdated now. It's before all the scholarship. His arguments were not great, but I feel like he or someone like him could do this again, address the actual arguments made in the literature, and come up with good, sound logic to argue. One thing I didn't mention is that Jesus Studies, as an isolated patch, is mostly populated by believers. Of the non-believers, most of them are actually trained in theology and Christian apologetics, so they don't have great methods. I'm not aware of any historian, like trained PhD historian, who actually argues that Jesus existed in academic setting. They might have the casual opinion that he did, but that's not the same thing. Personal opinion is not evidence. So what we need is someone who's qualified in history, who understands the methodology to argue that Jesus existed. I see a comment mentioning Tom Holland. He has a master's degree in medieval history. I mean, if he wants to try and write an argument that Jesus existed, he is, of course, welcome to. As far as I know, he hasn't done that yet. I'm also surprised that it's only Christians defending Jesus so far. There's got to be some atheists who believe he existed. Okay, in the absence of any other callers attempting to defend him, we can move on to some other interesting evidence. Oh, we got somebody else coming in. It's Dave. Hello, Dave. You are currently on mute.
Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yep, I got you.
Excellent. So, I listened to your conversation, the other gentleman. There were some things that you said that I found a little bit odd.
Yeah, sure.
let's see, like, so one of the things that jumped out at me is like, there's a point at which there was some dispute over the veracity of the miracle accounts, and you'd said something along the lines of, you're using faith to rather than reason to argue for this position, and it just kind of strikes me as a bit question begging, because I mean, if you're talking to a Christian, let's say, who thinks that these texts are absolutely true in every sense, they're not going to justify them. I mean, they think the miracle claims happened, so they don't think that the fictitious insertion of mythology is evidence against the veracity of the entire account, because they don't think that that's a fictitious insertion of mythology. They think that happened, and if you ask them why they think the miracle accounts happened, they're not going to say, well, I just take it to be true. They're going to give you some story about the flourishing of Christianity and the death of the apostles and the this and that. I mean, it's not just, you can't just say, oh, you think the miracles happened, therefore you're arguing based on faith and this is all irrelevant. I mean, you actually have to make that point.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
that's
you just
why
kind of
I
beg into
address the
question.
evidence that's raised, but if no evidence is raised, I mean, there's not much I can say, to be honest, apart from point out that no evidence was raised.
Well, yeah, but just as long as it's clear. I mean, you can take a position that the miracle accounts are true and just disagree with, because you said it's a piece of evidence. The miracle accounts are a piece of evidence that the account is mythologized, and
So
that's only
it's
true
evidence
if you.
against the reliability of the source, effectively. It's not evidence that Jesus didn't exist. It just means it discounts that as a reliable source for Jesus.
But that's only true if you think that's a fictitious insertion. If you're a Christian, they just don't agree with you on that premise. They think that the account is true. So it's not for a Christian. You can't. If you're trying to tell a Christian, look, Jesus is probably mythological, and part of the reason I think that is because the miracles are in there. That's just not going to land with them.
And I agree that this should be a debate among atheists. Like, Christians don't really have the epistemology required to be able to argue for either position on this, because I mean, I guess a Christian could try and argue from the perspective of a non-Christian, but you're best off having like professional scholars debate this back and forth, and they should be atheists on both sides, ideally, because you don't get bias cluttering it up.
But that doesn't strike. I mean, that doesn't strike me as very charitable. I mean, there are a huge number of very, very intelligent theist and indeed Christian philosophers who have a tremendous grasp on Bayesian epistemology and epistemology in general, and they've reached different conclusions.
They wouldn't be Christians then, but yeah, I mean, I wouldn't disagree that they're intelligent.
Well, but that's just your position. I mean, this is where I think this is getting a little bit. To my ears, it sounds a bit. I mean, I don't want to use the word arrogant, because I don't think you've come off arrogant, but intellectually one-sided. I mean, if you're just gonna, I mean, there are in the philosophical literature, especially in epistemology, there's a whole literature, for example, in the lineage of Hume, to discussing like what exactly can our credence be in a miracle claim, for example, and people come down on different sides of it. It's not fair to just say, oh, you think miracles happen, therefore you, as you just suggested a minute ago, you can't really take part in this discussion.
Now, we're discussing history, and history is about probability, and miracles are by definition the least probable thing. So they've effectively excluded themselves from the conversation. So if a Christian wants to argue without using miracles, that's fine. I've got a Hakeem waiting to join as well.
Okay, sure. Well, why don't you take Hakeem?
Okay. I have no idea if more than one person can join at a time.
No, you can't. Oh, he left.
Let me try. I think Hakeem, I think you're in now. Oh, no, he's not. Okay, while waiting for another person to join, I mean, there's far more material than I could go through, like in hours, probably days of time, because of the sheer volume of the scholarship on this issue. But so there's an interesting parallel before Christianity existed, which is Philo of Alexandria, who was around in the first century, sort of pre-Christian times. And he actually mentioned finding within the Old Testament an archangel who was a son of God, the agent of God's creation, the Logos, a lot of things that were also attributed to Jesus. And really interestingly, he actually quotes from Zechariah 6. Zechariah 6 actually has a character in it who is named Jesus, the Son of Yahweh the Righteous. I believe that's in Zechariah 6:11. So Philo's archangel may even have been called Jesus. We don't know because he didn't explicitly say that. We're missing some of his books, but you can see how somebody can create a Jesus Christ Messiah purely from reading Old Testament scripture. You don't need a real guy around to do this. Sometimes people will say Jesus must have existed because there had to be a founder. I mean, yeah, there had to be a founder, but why does it have to be Jesus? You can easily have Peter as the founder, which is what Paul says. Peter is the first person to have a vision of Jesus, and he's the guy who kicks off the whole cult. So it looks very much like Peter is the founder based on our oldest sources for Christianity. I think to this day, the Catholic Church elevates Peter as their first pope. There is an argument that Peter was illiterate, but unfortunately that's based on the book of Acts, and Acts is not a very helpful source because it's 2nd century, directly contradicts Paul. It even uses Josephus as a source, so it's not particularly helpful for this. Right, let's have a look at some of these comments as well. If a bias for mythologizing discards the work of history, throw away basically all that we have until like 3 centuries ago. That is true to a point. So history was a lot less careful until, to be honest, around the 1950s actually. But just because they added mythology in and they had a bad history fact checking doesn't mean you discard all of it. It just means you treat the sources more carefully. How plausible is what they're saying? Because the idea that you discard all of it is like an all or nothing black and white fallacy. It's the truth is going to be somewhere in the middle. They probably had some inspiration from somewhere. I've got Dave again. Hi, Dave.
So, in the interest of having a conversation, I called back since Hakeem hung up.
Yeah.
And we can just set aside the issue that I brought up before. We don't need to talk about that anymore.
We can talk history, historical methods, historical sources.
Yeah. So why do you think that? And I did hear a lot of what you said. I just don't have it memorized. But remind me again. So let's say that we both agree that the miracles are fictitious. They're not accurate. So, I mean, let's say I think that, Jesus, probably a real person, probably a real teacher, probably got killed. I mean, there were a lot of people that fit that description in that time period. He kind of fits into a class of person. And there was probably some mythologizing that went on around him and that started this religion. Why is that less plausible in your mind than this other idea that kind of Peter invented Jesus? Because from where I'm when I'm thinking about this, I have a lot of examples of individuals founding religions claiming to be a prophet or claiming to be special for some reason. Joseph Smith, Muhammad, the Buddha to some extent. I mean, these are people who are probably real. They're the primary progenitor of a religion, and there's some mythologizing that goes on around them. That doesn't surprise me. But it's really weird if someone were to found a religion and base it on, their imaginary friend who was just here a few years ago and just got killed up there.
It's interesting that you used Joseph Smith and Muhammad as examples, because Joseph Smith claimed that Moroni appeared to him in a vision, and Muhammad claimed that Gabriel appeared to him in a vision, and Paul and presumably Peter claimed that Jesus appeared to him in a vision. So if you're talking about like a reference class, that puts Jesus in the fictional character section. The same thing about all the weird parallels between Jesus and saviors like Hercules and Romulus and Dionysus and these fictional characters that we know didn't exist, like Oedipus, for example. If you look at the rank Raglan reference class, Jesus fits right into there as like one of the highest ranked saviors. There's way too much, like he had a mysterious birth, his childhood is shrouded in mystery, we know very little about it.
Yeah.
A lot of these points line right up with Jesus.
Yeah, but we agreed that there's some mythologizing, right? If my position is, let's say for the sake of the argument, I think he was real and that he was a teacher and that he did get killed because he was trying to lead a Jewish rebellion, or the Romans at least thought he did. And there's a lot of mythologizing around that. And it seems to me that pointing these things out doesn't do anything to my, like, you haven't really scored a point on me there by pointing out that the way it's mythologized. I mean,
okay, how about this? So you were talking about Jesus being a rebel who led a rebellion against the Romans. Where did you get that idea? Because that's not in the sources.
Well, I mean, just from stuff I've heard about, no, not Jesus in particular, but that there were a lot of teachers, there's this idea that, I mean, Jewish teaching, at least, I think, from what I understand, was that the Messiah would come and he would liberate Judea from the rule of the Romans, or at least that's how it was understood. And so a lot of messianic figures were trying to fulfill that role. And you did have multiple Jewish insurrectionists, especially during that time of occupation, which isn't unusual for, a religious area under occupation. So it just,
but that
whether Jesus was or
doesn't
not.
fit Jesus. So you're basically arguing for a guy who isn't Jesus at that point.
Why wouldn't that? Well, what I'm saying is that there probably was a character named Jesus, or whom Jesus is based on, probably one guy, and there's some mythologizing that goes around his legacy. Let's say that's the position I'm arguing for. So,
yeah, but
obviously, I don't think everything.
Huh? Is this being argued from a source, or are you making up this character and then arguing he existed? Like, because I'm trying to use the primary sources and arguing based on what they actually say, and you seem to be arguing for. Okay, which source is this in?
It looks like this is based on a real teacher that probably got killed. So just take the gospel.
What is your source for this?
Well, just take the gospel accounts for starters. I'm just saying.
Okay, so
this looks
where's
like
the insurrectionist Jesus in the gospel?
I didn't say the insurrectionist Jesus was there in the gospel. I said what it appears to me is, let me be as clear as I can. What it appears to me is the gospel accounts are based on a real person, but that there's some mythologizing around the real person. And the real person probably was a religious figure, a messianic figure, someone who was teaching, saying at least some of the things that we have recordings of Jesus saying, or something similar, going around Judea.
Yeah, so the teaching, for example, we can take that as an example of a claim about the figure of Jesus. So how do you know he was teaching?
Well, I'm looking at the gospel accounts. I'm saying here's a historical source about a man. Some of this is probably
you're looking at the gospel,
false. Yeah. Start with the gospel accounts.
So what is the source for the gospels? How did they know what they're talking about?
What's the source for the gospels?
Yeah, so I assume you're using Mark, right? Are you using the oldest gospel?
Mark's probably the best.
Yeah, okay, so let's use Mark. How does Mark know about this Jesus? Where does he get his source from? What does he cite?
Well, I don't think we know exactly who the author of Mark was.
I'm not talking about who the author was. I mean, what are the sources used? Where is he getting this information about Jesus?
Mark, if I remember correctly, is... I might not, but it seems to be kind of emerging from an oral tradition that existed probably in the interim between 30 and whenever Mark was written in 50. But it's without knowing who wrote it. I don't think he said. Maybe he probably does say. Doesn't he say he got it from the brother? No, I'm thinking of the wrong one here.
No, he says he's getting it from the Old Testament.
Well, I don't think he says I got this story about Jesus from the Old Testament. He might say that. Look, what do you mean?
I mean, he quotes the Old Testament as if it's Jesus speaking, and he even says, "I got this from the prophets." So, this was so the prophecy could be fulfilled, and so on. So there's nothing in there that looks like it's from a Jesus.
Well, that's not really. I mean, look, everybody in Judea is familiar with the Old Testament. Certainly, anybody in the rabbinic tradition is familiar with the Old Testament. Like, if I think that there was a Jewish teacher going around teaching, pointing out that he was quoting the Old Testament isn't really surprising to me. It's unsurprising that a Jewish teacher would quote the Old Testament or say things from the Old Testament, if that's what you're saying.
Yeah, But the way evidence works is, if you have evidence, it should support your position more than it supports the other position. So on
Yeah.
mythicism, they're using the Old Testament and attributing it to Jesus. We have explicit references of this happening, especially in 1 Clement. But you're arguing that it wasn't just the Old Testament. You're arguing that Jesus himself said this. So when Mark says he's going to quote Jesus and then just quotes the Old Testament, that fits me just as well as it fits you. Like, that's not evidence for either position, is it? So
No,
what you need
I
is evidence
wouldn't.
that pushes the probability in your direction.
When did the burden of proof shift here? I thought you were saying, because you were saying that
No,
he's
I'm
fake,
saying it's not
and
evidence either way. So that fits
I
both
agree.
theories.
It's not evidence either way. But you brought up that Mark. The reason I said this about Jesus probably quoting the Old Testament, it was in response to this point you made, where you brought up how Mark writes about Jesus and he's just quoting the Old Testament. And I'm saying
So
that fits
you were
just as
talking
well
about the
with
teachings of Jesus, right? To be evidence for Jesus, you're looking at the teachings for Jesus within Mark, or teachings attributed to Jesus in Mark, right?
I'm looking at an account of a Jewish teacher teaching Jewish things, presented as a historical character, documented in a historical document. I'm not talking about
when you say
specifically the
historical
lines from the Old
document,
Testament.
yeah. So Mark exists on both theories. On mythicism, Mark is the first attempt to place Jesus into history using euhemerization. Are you familiar with Euhemerus, the author?
No.
So what he did was he took the stories of Zeus the god, and he wrote Zeus into history as a historical character. He took the god and placed him on Earth. He did the same thing for, I'm trying to remember who it was. Was it Dionysus? So he was taking gods and placing them on Earth. So
Yes.
on the mythicist thesis, this is what Mark was doing. So what we really need is evidence that that's not what Mark was doing, or we need evidence before Mark for the existence of Jesus.
But the mythicist thesis has to be more than just there was a lot of mythologizing going on because they were trying to make Jesus look like the Messiah.
Yeah, there's loads more, but I can only state so much within the time we have.
As you just said before, though, I mean, these aren't points that tell between an atheistic view of a historical Jesus and an atheistic view of a mythological Jesus. These are just points that are consistent with both ways of looking at it. It doesn't tilt the balance either way to point out that, like, I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
What you want is primary sources. So, for example, we kind of glossed over it, but you mentioned oral tradition, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a common excuse used by Christian apologists. I know Bart Ehrman uses it as well. I've never seen any evidence for it. Like, how do you know that there was oral tradition, or what it said, or that it wasn't mythicist? I mean, where are we getting this from?
I don't know exactly where he gets it from. He thinks that Jesus was a historical character, and so what he thinks happened in between the death and the writing of Mark is, well, people were telling stories. So he says, look, what's in Mark is a lot of it's made up, and it's 30 years after the fact. What happens in between? People tell stories and legends get built. So he's not saying that the oral tradition is what establishes the historicity of Jesus or anything like that. He's saying that he thinks Jesus was historical for a plenitude of reasons, and the way that he explains
he explicitly cites this oral tradition as an independent eyewitness account of Jesus. That's how he uses it. The problem is he got this from being trained in Christian apologetics. So Ehrman's PhD is from a theological seminary, and it is in theology. So he's not trained in a historical method, unfortunately, and he's within the circle of Jesus studies, which has been somewhat castigated for having awful methods compared to the rest of history. But if we take that one for example, without addressing anything else, just look at the evidence. We have a claim that Mark is based on oral tradition, which goes back to a historical Jesus. We don't have this oral tradition. It's not cited as oral tradition, so this is just a guess at best.
Yeah, I again, like that's fine, but he's not saying that Mark, that there's a historical tradition and therefore there's a historical Jesus. He's saying, look, I think there's a historical Jesus, and people say, like, well, then how do you explain the mythical, the miracle accounts? He goes, well, I mean, that was written 20 years after the fact. Like, what happens in between? Obviously, there's just an oral tradition. If you have a historical event, and then an account written afterward. In between, by definition, you have an oral tradition. So he's not. You're going the wrong way with that.
If we
that's,
had
that's
that,
not.
it would at least be cited or would appear in there. But when you break Mark apart and look at his sources, he's using the Old Testament. So where is the oral tradition if he's literally just using the Old Testament and he's using Paul? Because Paul doesn't mention this oral tradition.
The
He's
oral
just
tradition
talking about a
isn't
celestial
evidence
Jesus.
for the historical Jesus. I agree with you on that.
Yeah,
I think that the gospel accounts are, though.
So we've talked a bit about evidence for Jesus. I don't know where you're getting it from the Gospels, because you've just said that there's no source in the Gospels that traces back to a historical Jesus. But what about evidence against a historical Jesus? Is it though?
Yeah, it's a story. It says, here's a guy. We followed him around. Blah blah blah. He said these things. It's like a dry. Well, in some sense, it's
You
not
just
really
said
dry.
he's a guy. We followed him around. Who says that?
I'm paraphrasing, obviously.
Yeah, I think you're reading stuff into the Gospels that isn't actually in the Gospels, and this is a common problem where people don't read the Gospels for themselves. They mix all the Gospels together in a big jumble, and then have a picture in their head of what it says. But if you read the actual Gospels as they are in their context, it doesn't say that.
Do you disagree that Jesus is presented in the Gospel text as a historical figure, or whether or not you think he actually was? Is he presented as a historical figure?
Or is he I absolutely agree. He is presented as a historical figure. That's all
I'm saying. I'm saying the fact that he's presented as a historical figure is evidence that he was.
I mean, that's the claim that we're discussing. So there's a claim that Jesus was a historical figure based on Mark. There's nothing independent of Mark, so Mark is the best we've got, really. The problem is Mark's sources are where we really want to go to. So we know Mark isn't an eyewitness account. He's written a lifetime later, at least. It's probably end of the 1st century, could be 2nd century for all we know. It's very hard to date. He doesn't cite his sources.
Let's not go outside of mainstream scholarship, but the mainstream
I'm talking about mainstream scholarship.
On Mark, the typical agreed upon date for Mark between New Testament scholars, atheists, theists, whomever. Theists might want to say it's 50, atheists might want to say it's 70 to 80. People generally put it around 60 to 70. I mean, that's mainstream not scholarship 60, on Mark.
70 onwards is the dating used by critical scholars. It could be 70 up to maybe 150. We don't actually have a reliable end date for this, so we'll say 70s is fine, but we can't cement that as a solid date. That is a problem. But I'm talking about his sources. So regardless of how late it is, we're talking about where did he get this information. There are a couple of other people who want to join.
Yeah,
so
why don't we? And I'm getting some complaints about my mic too. So it's been good talking to you. Maybe we'll have a chance to discuss this later.
I appreciate the conversation. Yeah,
I'm making people's ears bleed, evidently. So, all right. Thanks, Joel. Good stuff. See you.
Okay. Let me get Otangelo. Hi, Otangelo. I think you're on. Yep, we should be able to hear you if you speak now. I summoned the voice from the... Nope, I guess we're not getting any sound from... We do have Andrew waiting as well, so if we continue to have audio issues with Otangelo, we'll have to switch to Andrew. No, I'm going to have to give up on...
Hey, can you hear me?
Hey, I can hear you. Yeah, I'm sorry, Otangelo didn't really have a chance to get through there. Never mind.
Okay. So are you making the claim that Jesus did not exist based on your assessment of the evidence as a historical person, or that this is a claim that is made by some people?
A bit of both. So this is the position of the scholarship on this question of whether Jesus existed, and also from my own examination in detail of the evidence. So I am not a qualified historian. I don't even have a degree in history, so I'm not saying I'm an authority or qualified by any means. But on my amateur assessment of the evidence, I think I can put forward a convincing case that Jesus didn't exist as a historical person, and that's like a
Okay,
two-part
so
thing.
aside from I would make a counterpoint against what I perceive that you're making a point that an oral history is not reliable. But I could give examples where that's not the case, where it is very reliable from my home region. But um, what other evidence would you put forward saying that besides that, if I even interpreted that point correctly?
Yeah, so basically, every time you try and find evidence for Jesus, it kind of falls apart. It always goes back to Mark, and Mark is very weak evidence. It's hearsay at best. It's unsourced, and it all traces back to the wrong sources. Like it doesn't go back to an actual Jesus. We have evidence against that, which is the earliest source for Christianity. Paul explicitly denying that he got any of his information about Jesus from a historical Jesus, because he says his only sources for Jesus are visions and scripture. And he's apparently not challenged on this by any of the other apostles either, because according to Paul, an apostle is someone who only sees Jesus in visions. That's basically his criteria for what an apostle is. Um, and we do have an issue as well with that as well, which is Paul does not have the concept of disciples. He never says the word disciples. He has no knowledge of Jesus's family. He has no knowledge of Jesus's followers. To Paul, Jesus is a guy who appears in visions. So, would you consider this evidence against Jesus or not?
A few things. When when you're reading the Bible, what you're reading is a collection of scriptures that have been pruned down by, in the first place, the Romans. So in the early era of what is now called Christianity, it was fairly radically opposed to the Roman Empire, and so there was extreme repression on behalf of the Romans until Constantine converted in, I think, 313, and then in 367 a different emperor made it the official state religion. And at that point, um, they pruned out basically scripture that they didn't feel served the purposes of the state. And then you have very similar processes like this when you have, I guess they're called ecumenical councils over the intervening centuries between then and now. So for one, and the other thing too that I'm familiar with is that there's a good argument that there's actually multiple people who are now credited as the author Paul, because most of Paul's attributed contributions to the New Testament are a series of letters to other communities of Christians around the Mediterranean area. But there's a few things I'll bring up. So for one, the term disciples. I mean, in rabbinical tradition, especially kind of mystical rabbinical tradition, Jewish tradition, which seems to be the closest you could compare to this, for now we'll say, literary or historical figure of Jesus. It was very common. In fact, it was standard universal practice to take on students and to have them imbibe the oral history that you have memorized, the scriptures. Now, there are also scrolls, written scriptures at the time, but it is still a largely oral tradition um, for this Jewish oral history. And so, to call these people disciples and to attribute, um, magical feats to them, I guess is how most people would probably call miracles. That is a sort of literary, and I guess I would call it like social device that I attribute more to the Romans and to the later ecumenical councils that have built up this large landowning, financially powerful series of religious institutions. But I guess where I land is that it does seem there's also, I want to get your take on Tacitus, who wrote about Jesus's execution. He's a Roman, I guess, analyst or
Historian
historiographer.
fits, yeah.
Yeah.
A politician and historian. Yeah, so he wrote about 116 AD in the Annals. The problem is there are no Christians. So Christians were reading Tacitus for an understanding of their own history, and there's no mention of Tacitus mentioning Jesus until hundreds of years later, when
Well,
around the time
100 year
when
later.
Christians were forging stuff, and that's when suddenly Jesus appears in Tacitus.
The other thing I'll mention just really quickly for as a point of information for the chronology. So if we're arguing, are we arguing then that Mark's writings were roughly 60 years after the death of Jesus, or in 60 A.D.?
So 70s onward, effectively. 70s at the
70s.
earliest, maybe
So
after.
my understanding also is that Jesus' death is placed around the 30s A.D. So we're then
Yeah,
talking about
although
less than a lifetime. And again,
to be
I guess
fair,
I'll
the
table it
reason
for
that it's
now, but
placed around the
oral history
30s.
can be extremely accurate over hundreds or thousands of years.
Yeah, so the dating Jesus to the 30s is primarily based on the day of the week of Passover. A big problem with that is you wouldn't crucify someone around Passover. So we know that's not historically plausible. That's an issue. We're also basing it
Based
on
on what
the.
evidence would you assume the Roman Empire would not crucify someone based off of a Jewish holiday?
So the Romans were actually pretty respectful of Jewish beliefs within Judea. It was part of keeping the peace. Jews had special dispensation as a respected religion because the Romans respected antiquity in religions, so they treated Judaism fairly respectfully. As long as the Jews didn't cause revolts, that was when they went and flattened the temple.
Yeah, well,
But
that's
yeah,
kind
so
of the
we
operative
have
point,
evidence
right? So
of this.
Jesus was, at least what he's credited with saying in the Gospels is saying things like basically, don't concern yourself with Caesar, like render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but primarily focus on this other project, this other work, and what he's describing as God's work.
Yeah,
And he
so
was
Paul was
a,
very
a fairly radical
interested.
figure in contrast to the Roman Empire's governance of its various colonies at the time.
Yeah, Paul was interested in kind of coexisting with Rome because obviously cults that didn't do that got flattened. Um, but so yeah, I was just talking about the dating to the 30s. So it's based on that day of the week, which we
Well,
know is historically
I guess
plausible.
I'm still taking issue with your statement that the Romans wouldn't crucify somebody who's a radical figure that they would consider the source of revolts in respect for their own religious holidays, and also the fact that once there was enough tension with the broader Jewish community there in the Roman Empire, they destroyed
Well,
the primary temple.
where
So
are
I
you
don't
getting
think that.
revolts from?
Well, I'm just saying that you use that language. The Romans were you giving special dispensations to the Jews unless they were revolting. So then in 70 AD, I guess or 73 AD is the generally given date for the Roman.
66 to 70 would be the Jewish war, yeah.
Yeah. So we're talking about
But you're
in
talking
a
about the
short period
30s.
of time. No, you're mixing a lot of points here. I just want to take issue specifically with your argument that you don't think that the dates for Jesus' crucifixion in the 30s are reliable because you believe that the Romans were, as a rule, respectful of the Jewish religion in order to basically keep the peace within that realm of their colonies. While I
Yeah,
agree
and
that
that's well evidenced,
have
and
they may have writings that say, oh, we respect these things, and there may be some evidence to that point, but there's also what I'm pointing out as evidence to the contrary, which is if at any point the Romans were not really happy with the behavior overall of one section of the population in that region or one particular religious sect in that region, they had no trouble destroying their most sacred um, site. So I don't think that that really lines up with the characterization that the Romans would never have executed a radical figure in a religious sect just to keep the peace when there's
no,
evidence that
I
they
mean
did
the
far
Jews
to the
wouldn't have done
contrary.
that anyway. So
Well, the
this
Romans are
story.
credited with crucifying Jesus.
Yeah, but the narrative is that he was tried by Jews and ordered to be executed by the Jews, the local Sanhedrin, effectively. So that doesn't track with history. In fact, everything about the trial of Jesus doesn't make sense. It looks like it was cribbed from Josephus, because there's a similar character there, Jesus ben Ananias, and he has a very similar trial account as Jesus. Like the parallels are way too close in the Jewish War, so it looks like Mark used that as inspiration for his trial account. But there are multiple implausibilities with it.
Well,
The
yeah, it's
stuff that Jesus
possible Mark.
says.
It's possible Mark used that as inspiration for his trial account, or it's possible that that was basically a common practice in that region.
Yeah, so it's not great evidence, but we were talking about the 30s. So one of the things placing in the 30s is the idea that it was around Passover. It's like trying to put the dates together for that. The other two things that place it around the 30s are supposed to be the birth date of Jesus, which is based on the accounts in Matthew and Luke. Matthew's based on a virgin birth story, and it's based on the idea that Herod slaughtered loads of innocents. That didn't happen because it would have been written about by all the other contemporary authors of the time, and it's just a retelling of Moses. So we know that's false. That didn't happen. So that we can throw out the window in terms of dating Jesus. The other one is the census of Quirinius, which
I don't
Luke
know. I
appears
mean,
to
the
be pulling
Romans
from
are a
Josephus.
fairly brutal society, were they not?
Yeah,
So
but you can't
a
argue it's
local
possible, therefore it's
viceroy.
probable.
No, I'm just saying that I'm not saying that it's possible, therefore it's probable. I'm saying it's very much in line with other behavior we know that the Romans carried out over, centuries, and also other behavior that similar empires before that the Romans based their model on, and empires that have come afterwards and based their model upon Rome do the same. They
Yeah, but
conduct
the idea that
extreme
the people who wrote
violence
about
in
Herod
their
wouldn't have
colonial
noticed that.
periphery. This is typical behavior of an empire, especially the
Yeah, so
Romans. They conduct wanton, often ethnically or religiously based violence, or simply any violence they feel will uphold the power of the state, especially in their colonial periphery, which is exactly this region.
yeah, but if you're writing the history of Herod and he massacres all the babies in a village, are you not going to mention that? Seriously? It's not plausible.
I don't think so. I think that there's been greater whitewashing of American atrocities by American authors who are contemporary to the events that took place. Very
No,
often we get the
I'm
truth
talking about
later.
hostile accounts. I'm not talking about whitewashing. I'm talking about accounts that didn't like Herod. So that it's just not historically plausible, and you can see they lifted it straight out of the story of Moses, and this is something that Matthew loves doing. He takes the Old Testament and retells Jesus in the role of Moses.
I mean,
And also
I
Matthew's
think
copying
this is
from
a
Mark, so
good
why do we
critique,
trust
though.
Matthew anyway?
Actually, I do think this is a good critique of, in general, a lot of parts of the Bible. The people who are really sort of in awe of the Bible, and they think that it's like a divinely inspired work, will often comment how many times it sort of like internally fulfills itself and overlaps these different stories that sort of take care of um, earlier prophecies or earlier contradictions in what they think is a beautiful poetic way. I think that could certainly be an artifact of self-reference. But I don't necessarily think that, saying, oh, well, whether it was 70 or whether it was 40 years, whether or not we say that the 30s is a acceptable date for Jesus's execution by the state, or whether or not you think that his trial fits into the sort of jurisprudence of the day, and whether or not that actually means that it's more or less plausible. I don't think I don't think that discounts oral history. And so I'll give two instances of oral history being proven exactly correct, surprisingly correct, but from the opposite end of the planet, and they're from two different tribal accounts of natural disasters where I'm from in kind of Western Washington. So one of them, there was an account of a large earthquake. Actually, this may have been an island up on the Canadian coast and not directly in Washington, but the point being it's nearby. Um, they had basically an account that there was a massive earthquake that destroyed all these people and buried them, and that the few survivors fled and made a similar village elsewhere. And there hadn't been archaeological evidence to find that site, but around the same time that site actually was discovered, they found all these people buried in landslides. They also found that there was a connected tsunami in Japan. I think this happened in like the 17th or 18th century. And they call it in Japan the orphan tsunami because the earthquake, they didn't feel the preceding earthquake that typically accompanies a tsunami in Japan that happened in basically the Pacific Northwest of the United States or Canada. And the other example, there's a place called Crescent Lake. And there was a story that's very traditional oral history of a couple of tribes around that area in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, where they talked about basically Thunderbird and another mythical creature were fighting, and Thunderbird shot a bolt of lightning at the other creature and missed, and it created a giant landslide. Well, there's now been very ample geological evidence showing that there was a landslide that I may not have been preceded by the lightning exactly, but I think the other mythical creature in the story caused an earthquake, and it blocked off this river to create Crescent Lake, which is a very beautiful place you can look up in Western Washington. So these events took place hundreds or thousands of years before there were Western written accounts in the area and still accurately transmitted geological information to the people in this area. So
Yeah,
that took
and
place
oral
over far
tradition.
longer
So
than 40 or 70 years. So I don't think that it's implausible at all to say that this history could have numerous elements of historical reality in it, just because it's, in your words, a lifetime or at least a generation or two after the written events.
yeah, I'm not saying it's implausible. I'm just saying you can have myth transmitted through oral tradition, and you can have truth events, or a mix of the two. So what we really need is some sort of indication, some evidence that this is history. And of course, it would be nice if oral tradition was cited in some way, but it's not. And every time we trace the source back, we find that it's using Paul's epistles, or it's using the Old Testament, or it's using Josephus, or something like that. We're searching for this piece of evidence that leads back to an actual historical Jesus, and we just can't find it. I should also mention that at 7 p.m. on this same channel, we'll have Josh live with the Atheist Nightmare defending Christianity. So anyone else who's listening in and interested in tuning in for that, go for that as well. But just to address Paul. So Paul is the earliest source. Would you agree that's our earliest source for Jesus?
The earliest source for Jesus being Paul. I thought you mentioned earlier that it was Mark.
No, so that's the earliest source for a historical Jesus, but the earliest source for Christianity is Paul, right? So
I
he
suppose
wrote
so,
sort
but
of
it's not
in the
necessarily like
50s.
foundational as much as
No, it's
the four Gospels are.
no, it's not foundational. Well, the Gospels aren't foundational either. They're later. So the earliest source for Christianity we have in all writings is the Epistles of Paul. They're the oldest Christian writings we have.
I'm in no position to agree or disagree on that.
Okay, so mainstream scholarship dates the earliest letter to about 49 AD, and they go throughout the 50s to maybe 59 AD. That's kind of the extent of Paul's corpus. But Paul, being our earliest account of Jesus, you would think he's the closest to the start of the cult. He is the best source for a historical Jesus. But when you actually read what Paul says about Jesus, there's no historical Jesus in there. And I think this is a big issue for Christianity, having a historical Jesus. And I think that this should be
I
counted
guess
as
I'm
evidence against
not
Jesus.
really sure that this is a big issue for Christianity. And again, I'm not any kind of practicing religious person.
Yeah,
I just
sorry,
think that
I meant historicity,
typically,
not Christianity.
well, yeah, I guess, but you did. I mean, just off of the point that you were, I thought, verbally making a moment ago, Christianity doesn't tend to really cling to historicity or logic as like an underpinning of why they believe what they believe. So I'm not necessarily certain that this is like a poking a large
No,
hole that hasn't been made before in Christianity.
yeah, and to be honest, even if we could prove without a doubt that Jesus never existed in history, they would just go back to the original Christianity where Jesus appears in visions and so on. So Christianity could just carry on, to be honest. But this is more of a historical inquiry thing. So do you think the fact that Paul mentions no historical Jesus is evidence for mythicism, evidence for historicity somehow, or neither one?
I'd say neither.
How could it be neither? So on your theory, there's a historical
Because
Jesus.
again, no, it's not on necessarily my theory. I'm just saying that I don't think that
If
anything
okay,
you've
so
presented
defending
is
historicity, right?
what?
So from the perspective of there being a historical Jesus, so not necessarily your theory, right?
Yeah, I'm just saying that. I mean, I would quibble with almost all of the characterizations that you've made of the typical Roman Empire's behavior Other than I can't really comment. I haven't read extremely deep into the various accounts of Herod by different people. But I guess, like, to me, I don't think that saying, I mean, I know we've already hashed this out, but I don't think we can necessarily move past the point where you say that, well, I don't think that this dating for Jesus's execution and crucifixion, I don't think that that holds up because the Romans were such nice chaps in giving special dispensations to the Jewish religion, because that's how they did business in their colonies, when we also know that they did brutal, violent, anti-ethnic, anti-religious violence to uphold their state power in their colonial periphery. So, like, I
Yeah,
don't
well,
think that we can
Pilate's an
necessarily put
actual
all of these other
example.
points. I don't
So
think we can
we have
necessarily
accounts
put all
of
of these points behind us and say that, well, yeah, now that we've all settled all of that, here's what I think about Paul.
so that was purely about dating the gospel story of an execution to the 30s. That was one of the examples. Was the idea of crucifying him around Passover, which it doesn't fit historically. It's not
No, it doesn't
plausible
fit an
historically.
arbitrary interpretation of Roman behavior in that era, which, again,
No, I mean
I
it
mentioned
doesn't fit the
is
evidence.
heavily contradictory to actual Roman behavior.
I'm talking about the contemporary evidence of the time of Judaism and the Roman treatment of Judaism, and this is mainstream scholarship. I don't think it's really necessary to debate it. I was only making a point saying the dating to the 30s is unreliable. We don't really have a solid pinpoint for that. But one example, actually, so you were talking about the brutality of Romans. We've got an account of Pilate being vicious and like murdering a bunch of people, and the reason he was removed was for being too bloodthirsty. So that's one reason we know the Gospels aren't true, because the version of Pilate in the Gospels is totally antithetical to the actual Pilate from history. So again, it's a point against trusting the Gospels.
Well, I don't really trust. I mean, this is why I think that, for instance, the one version of the Bible that's been translated from Aramaic by one of the few remaining Aramaic speakers, and there's all this sort of controversy over this. There's very, and this is why I mentioned, like, the entirety of the bedrock of the scripture of the Bible was curated by the Romans. So again, I'm not necessarily saying that that's a point for or against historicity of Jesus, but I'm also saying that it's not necessarily convincing for me to see like, oh, there's huge contradictions in Paul's writings. If there was something that the Romans wanted to remove to pacify a rebellious sect of cultish radicals in their empire, it's absolutely something they would have done. And saying that, well, Pontius Pilate is depicted as a little bit more fair and kind in the Gospels that we now read today, and that we have other contemporary records from the time saying that Pilate was this, overly brutal, sort of local viceroy who had to be removed because his behavior was destabilizing to the power of the state. Again, that doesn't say to me, well, we can just throw out all of everything that the Gospels say about Pilate, even though I understand that they may well have been edited in favor of or against the favor of particular figures by the people who actually curated the scripture we're reading now.
Well, so I would agree the Romans, or at least Roman Christians, definitely sanitized and altered the text, and the surviving Bible or New Testament is fairly pro-Roman, or at least pro-coexisting with the Romans. But I can't agree that the Romans would just remove anything bad about Pilate, because our source for Pilate is Josephus, which is literally Roman propaganda, is what he's writing, because he defected to Rome, effectively. So if they were going to remove mentions of Pilate as being brutal just because it wouldn't be pro-Roman, that doesn't work, because it's Josephus who's our source, and he's literally writing Roman propaganda.
In any case, I'm not. I guess I'm just not all that. I'm not all that convinced still about the dating of the execution, and why you think that that's not very accurate because of a perceived policy of lenience towards the Jewish holidays and whatnot. And I guess,
think
like, you take a figure
so. I
like
think the 30s
George
is right.
Washington, who's lived an order of magnitude closer to our lifetimes than this Roman period. He's commonly described as like this anti-imperial liberatory type of figure who sort of upheld the values of freedom, when in reality he was the largest and a very brutal, at that matter, slave owner in the country. He stood to gain the most from creating an independent state that he and his class could run. And he was known by the tribes of indigenous people in the easternmost colonies, not the easternmost states of the United States, as the destroyer of villages. So again, like there's all
So I'm
sorts
not
of
saying it's not the
layers of.
30s, effectively. So I'm fine with the date of the 30s for the start of the cult, probably based on a Danielic timetable. I'm just pointing out that when people try and pinpoint this date in the 30s, the reasons they give for doing so are pretty flimsy. Like we didn't even address the census of Quirinius, which again, that's another really weak connection, because Luke says it's a census of the entire world where you have to go back to the birthplace of your ancestor 1,000 years ago, which is absolutely ludicrous. And he blatantly got that from reading Josephus' Antiquities, so it's not a reliable source either.
I'm fine with that.
But I'm kind of curious about your methodology. So, on the theory that Jesus didn't exist, we wouldn't expect Paul to mention a historical Jesus. And on the theory that Jesus did exist, we should expect Paul to mention a historical Jesus. And Paul doesn't mention a historical Jesus. So how are you not counting that as evidence for mythicism over historicity? And I'm trying to figure out how your logic is working there.
I guess because I haven't taken either position. I mean, we're left in the present with a cult that's based off of a series of religious and semi-political reforms in the midst of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, but
And
it's not about your position. It's about the objective way the evidence falls, right? So on one side, you would be expecting Paul to mention a historical Jesus, and on the other side, you would not expect Paul to be mentioning a historical Jesus. Paul does not mention a historical Jesus. So how are you being able to move the needle from one side to the other or to the middle? Like I don't see how you're treating the evidence in such a way that it just goes to the middle. I don't get your logic here.
I guess I'm treating it like take the numerous instances of witch trials as some type of similar example.
What?
It's fairly certain that nobody was practicing actual magical witchcraft in concordance with Satan at the time. That there was an economic or other incentive of social power to be gained by exterminating these people, whether it was
I'm
to
just
take
talking about
control of
basic.
an industry like brewing, or to root out homosexuals from your community. This is sort of the what we can ascertain to be the real material basis of why these witch trials were pursued multiple times over the years throughout Europe and also in the United States. And so I guess like we're left in the present with this massive cult. Most people think that Jesus existed and did all of these magical things, and that that his death was some kind of symbolic ritual to absolve us of of sin. I don't really believe in any of that, but I do think that it's likely based off, I don't think that everybody was having visions like Paul and saying that, Mark thought he was real, Paul did not think he was real. And again, I mentioned earlier that there's most likely multiple, at least
Well,
two
I
authors
should
who
point
are
out
actually
something, if I
writing
could just
that's
interject there.
attributed to Paul. Yeah, go ahead.
So when you say Paul didn't think he was real, I should correct you on that. Paul did believe he was real, but obviously didn't believe he was on Earth. So that's kind of the difference there. Because
That's
it
fine, but
can
I guess
be.
I'm still pointing out there's a case to be made that there are at least two distinct authors who wrote the writings that are now attributed to one figure of Paul. And you're saying
So I'm
because he
only
was
talking about the authentic
supposedly.
letters. So I'm not talking about the forgeries. There's at least 3 or 4 different authors, but I'm literally just talking about the 6 core Pauline epistles that are relevant to this.
Yeah,
So
so I guess
I'm discounting that.
what I'm saying is I could easily see a case where Paul and his aping forgers who tried to piggyback off of his pseudonym are basically falsifying or aggrandizing these visions that either didn't happen or they did happen, and are making more out of them to gain a material stake ahead of what they have in their society. But I could also see that perhaps over translation across 2 to 3 different languages done numerous times over 2,000 years for the interests of a state. I could also, for instance, take the verse that most people take out of the Bible to condemn homosexuality. Most people say that that is translated as saying a man should not lie with another man as with a woman because that's an abomination. But there's other translations from Hebrew and from Aramaic that actually say it's saying a man should not lie with a boy as with a woman because that's an abomination, which are two very different
those come from
statements.
Christian apologists and theologians. That's not what historians think that says. I've seen that pretty commonly used by like liberal theologians just to try and rescue the Bible, but honestly, why lie about what it says? Just admit what it says, and then
I'm
reject
not
the whole
saying that
Bible.
to apologize for the Bible or not. I'm just saying that to
No,
me, I
I'm saying
interpreted
that's where
that
that
as
claim comes from.
okay. Well, I'm just saying I interpreted that as two very different interpretations from a translation across 2 different languages that could be an easy mistake to make. I mean, in the fucking 2010, 2011 era, the State Department tried to have a reset of foreign policy with Russia, and they mistranslated that. And this is in modern English to modern Russian. So I'm saying it's possible that this was a real mistranslation that was made, or a translation that was made purposefully by mistake to uphold an anti-homosexual agenda.
I'm
So
talking about the scholars reading the original Greek or Hebrew, so mistranslation is less of an issue in that when you're talking about reading the original languages. I try and avoid issues with the English translations and just go straight to the source.
all right.
But I'm still confused as to how. So you're arguing it's possible that Paul just didn't want to mention a historical Jesus, even though one existed.
No,
Therefore,
I'm saying it's possible Paul was writing in what he thought was a really moving, poetic style, or whatever he thought would move the most people to his cause, and either did actually think and understand there was a historical Jesus human being on Earth, or he may have written it as though he's an astral figure that never touched the earthly plane, that is still a god we should worship.
yeah, but can you imagine writing 20,000 words about Jesus and never once even accidentally mentioning that he existed as a historical figure on Earth? I think the
No, I
odds
wouldn't
of that.
waste my time doing that.
Yeah, so if you think that the odds of that are very low, then why would you not consider this evidence against historicity? Because
I'm
it's about
I'm
context.
agreeing it could be evidence against historicity. I've said that like 3 times
Okay,
now, but you
well, I
want me
mean,
to
you
come
keep
down
saying
very
it's not.
hard on one side or the other.
Well,
And
you keep
I
saying it's
just
not evidence either way, but I don't see how that could be true. So you'd have. So you now say it is
I'm not saying
evidence.
it's not evidence either way. I'm saying I understand the case that you're making, and I also see other possibilities.
Yeah, but I'm talking probabilities, not just possibilities. And in order to find a way around this, you kind of have to make ad hoc excuses and reasoning, which is effectively what Christians and theologians do to avoid this conclusion. They'll sort of twist things and make them up so that it looks like Paul has some sort of reason to never mention Jesus being on earth. But the problem is every time you make up an excuse like that, it lowers your odds of
I'm
being
not
right.
I'm not really making up excuses, Joel. I'm
I'm not
saying that
saying you are.
you've
I'm not
made a
saying
good
you are.
case. I'm saying you've made a good case, and I said here's another interpretation that I have.
Yeah, so normally what people would do is they'd go into the details with Paul and they'd try and argue like individual pieces of Paul mean historical Jesus. I assume you're just not familiar enough with Paul's words to go down that route.
Yeah, I haven't been in Catholic school for about 12 years now, so
Yeah,
I don't
that's fair enough. I
haven't
can't
really
argue with that.
had to take a test on scripture or anything in all of that time.
Yeah, but I would encourage you, don't take my word for it. If you want to find out, read Paul for yourself and try and find anywhere where he places Jesus as a real person in history.
No,
And every time.
I do remember this even coming up. I know that he doesn't. It's okay.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. But yeah, again, I would always say don't take my word for it. Go read the sources, go read the history, investigate for yourself. Don't let people preach to you. So always fact check the stuff I say, because I'm doing a lot of this from memory, so I could be getting some of this wrong as well.
All right. Well, have a good rest of your show then.
Yeah, I appreciate you joining. I probably am going to end it there because it's been a couple of hours, but it was fun. I enjoyed guys calling in to a chat. So thanks, guys. Maybe I'll do another one of these in the future. And yep, don't forget to check out Pangburn's channel. The more debates coming up on more subjects in philosophy and theology and that kind of thing. So thanks, guys.